Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. So this is the second lecture for week, um, what is it? Week 6, right? Um, so second lecture, and this lecture will be, I will talk about the prompt for the second essay, um, and I will also talk a little bit about the second essay, and then chapter 7, right, of arguing about literature, right? So I didn't get to talk about that in the previous video, so I'll talk about that today. All right, so first off, let's talk about the prompt for the second paper. I've included a copy of it along with this video, but um, I also uploaded a copy in course materials on iLearn. All right, so have that prompt handy with you. Where is it? All right, so so the prompt is pretty much identical to the first one, right? As I mentioned last time, the second paper is pretty much going to be the same sort of setup, the same kind of um, the same kinds of argument, or not the same kinds of arguments, right? But the same structure as the first essay, right? Obviously, this will be a little longer. The first one is 1,100 words, right? This one is 1,200 words, right? And of course, this one you will be writing about either A Temporary Matter by Jhumpa Lahiri or Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, right? All right, so I won't go too much into the prompt because, as I said, it's pretty much the same. But I highlighted the 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 stuff that's a little bit different from the first one, right? Um, so if you look at it, I highlighted the fact that you have to choose either Temporary Matter or Sonny's Blues, right? You still have to come up with an issue, a question that you will then pose a claim for, right? Still, you know, uh, you're still asked to perform a close reading, right? And you can see chapter 4 of Arguing about Literature for close reading, right? And then the second highlight here, right? You should consider whatever comment I made in the first paper and apply it in the second paper, right? Repeated offense will result to extra point deduction, right? So some of you have gotten back your papers, right? I'm still working on um, the second batch of papers, right? So I should be able to send that out, everyone's papers out by the end of today, Friday, right? And so pay attention to my comments, my corrections, or whatever, right? And make sure you take that into consideration when writing your second paper, right? If I said that your paper needs more quotations, right? You need to engage more with the quotations, right? To avoid floating quotations, right? I don't want to see that repeated again in the second paper, right? And if I see that again in the second paper, then I will be deducting more points, right? So yeah, so just be mindful of that, right? Um, and then submit your paper as a Word document with the title, last name, and then essay 2, right? I forgot to mention this before, but it's easier for me, right? I mean, those who submitted PDF copies, I will, that's fine. That for the first paper, that's fine. And I have a way of, um, making comments on PDFs, right? But I really prefer Word document, right? It's easier for me and it's easier for me to organize, right? So if you can, please try to use upload a Word document format of your essay on iLearn, right? Um, and then before you submit it, make sure you change the title to, make sure you write your last name first and then essay 2, right? And then whatever you write after that, if you want to write anything, it's up to you. But it should be your first or your last name and then essay 2, right? The same with the third essay. It should be your last name and then essay 3, right? It just makes it easier for me to organize in my folder, right? Because like the names are on there. Yeah, so please, 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 please try to do that. It just makes it so much easier for me, and yeah, which means it will be easier for me to grade and then maybe grade it faster for the next paper, right? So I would really appreciate that. Okay, so pretty much everything is the same. I won't go back to this. You should reread this, prior to putting your second paper together, just to freshen up on, you know, on stuff that I require, right? Um, so still no works cited page. You're not required to do a works cited page. If you notice on the second page here, it's 1,200 words now, right? So make sure you're um, you're at 1,200, at least 1,200 words, right? Try not to go too much over. Maybe 100 word over is fine, but any more than that is too much. And then again, it's due Sunday, November 22nd, right? And if you need extension, just email me, and I'll be happy to give that to you, right? So yeah, so that's that for the prompt. And if you have any questions, please email me. All right, so just a couple of things. Things that I noticed in the first papers. Make sure when you're using Word document or you're using Google Doc or whatever, whatever you use to write your paper, please make sure to use autocorrect, right? There's a few papers that have kind of like grammatical errors, spacing errors, and all these kind of like little errors, right? And I like as I said, I'm not too strict on grammar, right? But if there's too much of them, right, it becomes very distracting. And so I take points, right? If there's too much kind of um, irregularities going on throughout your paper, right? There's spacing issues, spelling issues, grammar issues, commas, and things like this, and you can easily fix that just by using autocorrect, right? Because when I download your essay, and then it will show me that like there will be an underline or whatever, right? So autocorrect kind of tells me, right, that there are some issues here, right? So if I can see that, then you should be able to see that, right? Um, so please make sure to use autocorrect, right? That's kind of that should be standard for everyone, right? But then of course, you don't want to trust your computer, 100%, right? So you have to proofread your paper, right? Reread it before submitting it. Reread it a couple of times, 2, 3, 4, 5 times if you have to, right? Because it's only after a couple of times reading it that you see, um, you see issues, right? Or if you don't trust yourself, have someone else read it for you. It doesn't have to be, it could be just anyone, right? Because they will see things that that you might not see, right? So proofread, proofread, proofread your papers. Um, Right. I think that's it for that for now. Um, yeah, but of course, if there's something about my comments that you didn't understand or you want me to talk more about, you can just schedule an office hours meeting with me, and we can kind of you know talk about that in detail. Right. All right. So now we will talk about chapter 7. Right. So that's pages 196 to 258 of your arguing about literature book. Um, so research process. Right. So whatever what you're doing right now, right, writing your first and second paper, right, this is considered research, right, where you are reading something and summarizing something and analyzing something, and you're making an argument for the things that you're analyzing, and you're providing quotations which are evidence for your argument, things like this. So what you're doing now is that's considered research, right? Um, so there's that kind of research, right? Research really just means, like trying to look for different ways of thinking about something, um, trying to kind of summarize other people's opinions about something, right? Trying to interpret something, right? So research could, it means a lot of things, right? But what you're doing for your first and second essays right now, they are considered research, right? Um, but there's also another way of doing research, right? Which will be the kind of research that I will ask you to do for your third paper, right? Is outside research. And so, for outside research, you will be asked to include other sources, right? So you'll be asked to look for scholarly journals, look for scholarly texts, right? And then kind of engage with that in your argument, right? To make your argument even more complex, but it will also provide more evidence for you, and it will make your argument sort of more sound and more credible, right? So for the third essay, you will be asked to do outside research, right? Um, and right, so for the research right now that you're doing, right, for the first and second paper, you're really just using one text, and then you're asking questions and then providing answers for the questions, right? um, and and so on page 197, right, um, it says on here, another strategy, right, of research is to, this is the bottom of page 197. Another strategy is to list keywords, terms that occur to you as you study the work. These can become your search terms. The list below is an example, right? So looking for sort of keywords, right? So that's another way of, if you can't sort of um, if you can't think of what to write about, right? Or if you can't think of what to argue about, one of the first things that you should do, right, is to look for keywords. Like, what are sort of the kinds of events that are happening in this um, in the story, right? So, for example, in Jumpalahiri's uh, story, right? Some of the keywords will be immigrant experience, right? Marital relationships, right? Um, maybe what else could we do? right? Kind of like gender roles, right? Could would probably be, you know, some of the keywords there. And then for Sunny's Blues, right? So um, jazz obviously is one of the key terms. Civil rights movement, right? Brotherhood, right? That's another keyword that you can use, right? So you want to sort of like look for like keywords that might help you, and they can be kind of very abstract keywords, right? And then you can then start thinking about how that keyword, right, will inform your argument, right? So that's another strategy, right, for thinking about how to start your research, right? Actually, right now I am technically, I'm also writing an article um, for my 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 exam. I have an exam at the end of the year in spring, and I'm required to write an article for that exam, right? Which I will then kind of send out for publication, right? So it's a 20 to 25 page research paper that I have to write, right? And so I've started my research now, and right now I'm in a stage where I'm just reading everything. So I'm writing about a novel, right, called Insurrecto by Gina Pistol, who is, who uh, we will be reading at the end of this quarter, right? Kunanan. So she has a novel called Insurrecto, and I am writing a research paper, a research article on that novel, right? And it's a pretty new novel. It was written in 2018, so there's not really much written about it yet, right? And so I had to like look around and read everything right now, or last week actually. I read all the reviews, anything, literally anything that is written about Insurrecto, right? I had to read, right? So that's the first stage of my research. And then the second stage of my research would be to read everything about the author, right? So that means I have to read all of her works, which is good because I've already read, most of her works. And then have to read about her life, things that have been written about her, right? And so that's one way for me to find out why she does the way that she does, her style of writing, right, and so on and so forth, right? And then the third stage of the research will be to come up with keywords, right? Um, do I think, for example, post-colonial uh, relationship between United States and the Philippines, right? So that could be, some of the keywords, right? Um, so look for the keywords, and then I will then have to read um, books and articles about post-colonial theory, right? History of the Philippine-American relation, right? So that's another stage of the research, right? So so it's a lot of work, and then after that, then I will start, and I'm making notes as I do these research, right? And then after that, then I will try. I'm going to start sort of writing, the article, right? Making arguments, asking questions, answering questions, interpreting, right? Just the same way that you do, right? So that's kind of like a larger scale of what you guys have to do. But just so you have a sense of what research is like, right? When you're doing your PhD, um, that's kind of that's what we do, and and so yeah, so everything that we're doing, you're also doing in a smaller scale, right? You're reading other people's. Um, you will be asked to read other outside sources, right? And as you're doing research, you always want to take notes, right? If you ideally you should reread the story before writing about it, right? Even if you've read A Temporary Matter last week, right? Before you write the essay, the second essay, you should reread it again, right? And then make notes as you reread, right? And then in the process, just making notes always helps, right? Because you always forget kind of what you're thinking at the time and you're thinking it, right? So making notes is always useful. So yeah, so things like that. That's just I guess like some of the strategies, right, for doing research. When you have to look for outside sources for your third paper, as you read outside sources, you should always be making notes, right, on what you've read. All right, so on page 204 of Arguing About Literature, we see strategies for integrating sources, right? So this is taking quotations and then incorporating the quotations into your paper, right? Um, and I see a lot of issues, right? Having graded the first papers, I see a lot of issues on integrating quotations, improper integration of quotations, or not enough variations, right, in integrating quotations, or using quotations that are not really very helpful, right? Sometimes some people just quote for the sake of quoting, right? Uh, so the point of quoting, right, or the reason why I want you to quote, to use quotations, is that in your research paper, you have to provide evidence, right? You can't just your paper will not sound credible if it's just your own words, right? So it's like saying, here's my argument about something, here's my interpretation about something, but don't just take my word for it. Here's the proof, right? So your proof will be your quotations, right? And the way you sort of incorporate the quotations will either make your argument more, or will make your argument stronger, or it could make it weak if you're not uh, quoting properly, right? So please read this section on page 204, right? So I'll talk about at least two strategies, two ways of incorporating quotations, right? And so on the bottom of page 204, um, there's an example here of what they call limited quoting, right, or selective quotation, right? So it's just a way of quoting, short phrases and then weaving that into your own sentence, right? So for example here, right, the original quote is: the medical experts interviewed in the news coverage engage in a process of decontextualizing postpartum distress. What I mean is that the experts take the distress out of the social context of mothering and focus almost solely on biological causes of postpartum disorders. Right. So that's the original quote that the writer has taken out of the research. Right. Um, so that should be your first step too. If you're reading the story, right, and you see like a very interesting passage, right, you should just take that, write that down, right? So you have your quote, right? But it doesn't mean that you're just going to use all of that, right? um, you will then use that depending on uh, what's good for your paper, right? So in this case, um, the writer is using limited quoting to incorporate the quotation, right? So the writer is taking short phrases from the original quote, right, and then kind of weaving that into their sentence, right? Um, so the limited quoting here, right? Um, Dubrini is concerned that TV reports on postpartum conditions use medical authorities to emphasize biological causes rather than the social context of mothering, right? Um, and so in this case, right, sometimes you want to sound authoritative, right? So um, but you still want to incorporate quotes in your sentence, right? So this would be a good way to do that, right? Sometimes you just want to like put the quotation um, and then close read that. That's another story. We'll talk about that in a little bit, right? So yeah, so this is one way of using quotes, right? Just using short phrases and then weaving that into um, into your own sentence, right? Um, but then as you read here, they have to like the sentence has to be um, the quotes. They have to um, be integrated in your own sentence kind of seamlessly, right? So make sure there's no grammatical inconsistencies, right, as you include quotations. Right. So another example here, um, the original from Johnson's article. Two of the story's major structural devices are its contrasting of the husband's daylight world and his wife's nocturnal fantasy, and the religious imagery by which she highlights the liberating and redemptive qualities of her experience. Right. And then the limited quoting. Right. Johnson contends that although the heroine seems tormented, she actually finds her interaction with the wallpaper liberating and redemptive. Right. And notice too that they're choosing words that have important meaning, right? Like liberating and redemptive, right? Those are keywords, right? Biological causes, right? The social context of mothering, right? So they're not just picking random phrases, right? They're picking phrases that mean something, that are also keywords, right? Um, yeah, so that's one way. Um, and if you just want to follow the structure of these sentences, like I said, as long as you don't plagiarize by rewriting the exact same thing, right? You can take the structure of these sentences and then use that in your own writing, right? So that's one way to quote. The other way to quote, right, is through uh, longer quotations, right? So on page 205, it's talking here about block quotations, right? So I think I've mentioned this before, but for the sake of this class, we don't want to use block quotations, right? So block quotations are quotations that are 4 lines or longer, right? So if you have 4 lines of longer quotation, you kind of um, you create a block so you indent the entire quotation, right? Um, but you don't want to do that for our papers because our papers are very short, and so having a block quotation, it takes away from your own words, right, and from your own argument, and it doesn't make your argument stronger. Um, but what you can do, you can still do longer quotations, right? Just make sure they're, you know, no more than 3 lines. So if it's 3 lines or shorter, then you can still do that, and you don't have to block it. Um, right. And so when you use longer quotations, right? So the other way of quoting is limited quoting, right, or selective quotation, where you only use shorter phrases, right? And then the other way of quoting is using longer passages, right? And when you use longer passages to quote, 2 or 3 lines, right, you want to make sure that there's a lot going on in this passage, that the passage is very important because you want to talk about that passage, right? You don't just want to like, write that down and then forget about it, right? You want to, if you're quoting long quotes, right, 2 to 3 lines, um, after quoting, you have to talk about it, right? And what do I mean? And this is what I mean when I say, you need to engage with your quotations, right? In the comments, I say that, I want to see more engagement with your quotations, right? This is what I mean. And what that means is that if you're quoting longer quotations, the next sentence should be, you should at least give us a context, right? Or summarize it in a very short sentence, right? And then this is the next sentence after that should be analysis, right? Analyze what's going on here, right? And then connect it to your argument, right? So that's at least 3 sentences after a long quote that you have to perform, right, in order to justify using a long quotation, right? And so I have an example here of how to do that. So I've taken, and this example I'm going to give you as a separate document where I wrote the example so you can kind of follow me, right? So I've taken um, the last paragraph from A Temporary Matter, right, the short story, and I am going to, so I took, that's a very long uh, passage, right? So what I'm going to do is shorten it and then introduce it and then talk about it, right? And so this is how, if you're going to quote long quotations, 2 or 3 lines, this is a good example of how you should do it, right, in order to justify quoting a long passage, right? So let me just read the passage here. The original passage is Shukumar stood up and stacked his plate on top of hers. He carried the plates to the sink, but instead of running the tap, he looked out the window. Outside, the evening was still warm, and the Bradfords were walking arm in arm. As he watched the couple, the room went dark, and he spun around. Shobha had turned the lights off. She came back to the table and sat down, and after a moment, Shukumar joined her. They wept together for the things they now knew. Right. Um, so that's the closing paragraph, right? And so in my sample kind of passage here, obviously this is too long, and so I've shortened it. I put ellipses. So ellipses is the 3 dots, right? Which means that you've taken a portion of the quotations, right? So that's another thing. Ellipses you should only use in between the passages, right? You don't need to use an ellipses before or after, right? Just in between. So notice how I introduce it, right? So you have to introduce the quotes. At the closing scene of the story, we see even more uncertainty, right? So just a short kind of introduction, right? And then I put a semicolon here, and then the the long quotation, right? And this is like 4 lines ish. um, like I would still count this as 3 because like the top line is short and then the last line is short. So like I'm not like it doesn't have to be too technical, right? So this is fine. This length is fine. Um, but anyway, let's see. So at the closing scene of the story, we see even more uncertainty. Quote, Shukumar stood up and stacked his plate on top of hers, but instead of running the tap, he looked out the window. Shobha had turned the lights off. She came back to the table and sat down, and after a moment, Shukumar joined her. They wept together for the things they now knew. Right. So notice that I just took out a few lines or two lines, right? Uh, that I didn't think was important, right? So we get the point here, right? That there's uncertainty going on, right? And then I follow that, right, with contextualization, right? Here, the couple are now aware of their darkest secrets, which have not only put a strain in the relationship, but also caused their separation, right? So I'm just uh, giving a little bit of context, right, to the reader. Sometimes just to kind of like remind the reader what's going on, right? Um, that in fact this scene happened after they had shared their dark secrets to each other, right? But still, even with the knowledge of the things they now knew, right, Lahiri insists on uncertainty and the characters' inability to fully know each other by ending the story not with resolution but with even more tension, right? And so this assumes, so this passage, right, this imaginary passage that I made up, right, is thinking that, or arguing, I guess, that the point of the story is to highlight uncertainty and highlight tension and not resolution, right? Something like that. Um, yeah. So this is how you engage with a quotation, and I even re-quoted the last line here, the things they now knew. You can do that. That's also a good way to kind of you know make sure, like, reinforce the importance of this quote, right? um, yeah. So that's an example of how you can sort of talk about or summarize or contextualize long quotes, right? Or engage with long quotations, right? And this is just one example, but I encourage you to read all the sample essays, especially on chapter 2 or in chapter 7, right? There's more examples at the end of this chapter that kind of gives you um, you know other ways, right, different ways of incorporating quotations in your essay, right? So I think I'll just stop there for now, and of course, if you have any questions about this, just email me, and yeah, I will see you in the next video.